Hey guys, this is going to be a short video today. We're going to knock out these last two little sections, 516, 517. 516 is focused on aquaculture, which is essentially just agriculture, but in the water. So you may hear this called fish farming when we're looking at actual fish species, but this can also be done with things like crab, shellfish, and seaweed. So your essential knowledge, understanding the positives, the negatives of aquaculture, and then at the end you'll describe disadvantages and advantages and unintended consequences. So some benefits. Like I said, it's pretty much just raising fish, other aquatic species in cages or enclosures underwater. So understand a lot of times these fish are in like a netted or um, an enclosure that's in water that also has native fish around it. It's not like out in a field by itself, like normal agriculture. There is a lot of interaction between native species and the species we're farming. Now, some positives of this, it does require only a small amount of water, space, and fuel when we compare that to deep sea fishing. It's much easier when all the fish are contained in one small area. We don't have to go searching for them. We know they're right there. This reduces the risk of fishery collapse, where we said that's when 90% population decline in a fishery happens, and that's because we're actually breeding and raising these fish ourselves, not taking from the wild population, which is going to help maintain that species and genetic diversity in the wild. And of course, because it's in water, it doesn't take up any land space, which makes it more efficient compared to farming for animals that live on land. So, this is just an example of suspension aquaculture and fed aquaculture. So, in fed aquaculture, you can kind of have these giant pools, but they're, like I said, it's typically netted. The waste is able to escape. And we can do this with everything from typical fish, shellfish, seaweed, and then as those wastes go to the bottom, that's going to provide the food source for those kind of bottom dwellers like crab and other invertebrates. Now, some drawbacks. We tend to see very high density populations growing here, so we end up with a very high concentration of waste. So that can contaminate the water source through E. coli or eutrophication risks because of all those nutrients in the waste. Because of that high density, it also increases disease risk, which, since they are essentially growing in native waters, can be spread to native populations as well. And because they are growing in those native areas, if any escape, we can have some non native species or even genetically modified species getting introduced into a native population, breeding with the native population, and affecting that genetic diversity. And then, since they are in such a high density, to prevent disease spread and things like that, many fish farms do use antibiotics, which can contaminate water through the waste because those antibiotics are able to pass through the fish and enter the water source. So, this is a pretty good little infographic here that just looks at the environmental risks of marine aquaculture. So, we can have excess waste in the water, so that can increase disease, pathogens, all of those things. If we have those organisms escaping, then we can have invasives. We can have things competing with the native fish. Those antibiotics and herbicides are obviously adding chemicals to the water. And then in a lot of these places, there has to be some sort of predator control program, because obviously these fish would be very easy to catch for a predator. So we do have to control those predators in some way. So I want you to identify an advantage that aquaculture has over net fishing, and explain one environmental consequence of aquaculture. All right, and then our last section here for this monster of a unit is sustainable forestry, where we're looking at how we can use lumber without degrading the forest or depleting it for our future generations. One big word that gets thrown around a lot in environmental science, one of those good vocabulary words to keep in your pocket for the exam, is mitigating or to mitigate. So that just means reduce the effects of something. So here we're going to look at some methods that we use to reduce the effects of deforestation. Um, and at the end, we're going to justify a proposed solution by explaining potential advantages. So we've got what we call ecologically sustainable forestry, which, like I said, is just going through the process of forestry. So we're using trees still, we're collecting trees, but we're minimizing damage to the ecosystem to save habitats from being destroyed and soil from being eroded. One big way we do this is through a process that we call selective cutting or strip cutting, where we go in and we only cut maybe the oldest trees in an area, or trees that may not have as much individual diversity. Maybe it's a small population. So this is going to provide habitat still, because we're not going in and clear cutting, and it's going to also preserve our topsoil. You can see in the diagram over here, clear cutting leads to that extremely turbid, muddy stream that's not good for fish survival. But when we have selective cutting, where we've gone through and just taken a few here and there, or even our strip cutting, where we go through and remove an entire section, we're still leaving some buffer to protect that soil. Another way, this can be a little bit more time consuming and costly to do, but it's by using human and or pack animal labor to minimize soil compaction instead of using typical machinery. There's a lot less impact on the soil compaction when human and pack animal labor can be utilized as opposed to heavy machinery. Replanting some species that are being logged, so making that conscious effort to go in and um, replant the same species that we've logged, so that way we can maintain that same type of habitat and return it back to its natural state. And this is going to maximize long-term productivity of land, and it's going to preserve the forest for future generations. If we want to just be able to make as much money as we possibly can in maybe the next decade, then clear cutting is going to be the way to go if just making the money is our main objective. But if we want to actually maximize long-term productivity so we can continue to profit off of this piece of land for the long term, it's really important that we use these sustainable practices. So some of those practices are using recycled wood or simply reusing things. There's a perfect example of turning pallets into fancy little dining set for outside. Old wood can be chipped up, used as mulch for gardens or agricultural fields, which we've already talked about the benefits of keeping kind of a layer over that soil to retain moisture and reduce erosion by wind and water. Reforestation. So reforestation is really just replanting trees in an area that's been deforested. This is a really impressive effort. These were some photographers in Brazil who decided to reforest this valley area, and you can see an amazing difference in just 18 years. Um, and you can just imagine how much more diverse that after picture is going to be as opposed to the before picture. Another way that we can help keep our forests healthy and productive is by selectively removing diseased trees, because that's going to prevent the spread of infection from one tree to another tree. Number one, it removes the host for the disease. Number two, when we take those diseased trees out of the area, it decreases the density. So disease is not as likely to spread because the trees are going to be further apart. You can see this is an example here of not a dead, I'm sorry, a diseased oak tree. So if that is just left in an area, that disease could potentially spread to the other oak trees in an area. And then one big thing we are going to spend a little bit of time here with is fire suppression. because fire suppression has gone through a lot of ups and downs, and we're starting to see some really severe forest fires, especially out west. And so one big reason for that is that we stop all natural fires. So it fire suppression is just whenever a fire is started in the woods, whether it's through a natural cause or an unnatural cause, the immediate reaction is to go put that fire out as soon as it starts, which I understand does make sense, but when you look at it in the long term, really the only way that forests have to really break down a lot of that biomass is by fire. Um, so when we put out the fire, we end up with more dry biomass building up, which is just going to make future fires worse. If you look at this picture here, you can see all the, brown, decaying, even some of these trees in the background look dead. So if a fire comes through here, all of that's just going to immediately combust, making the fire burn hotter and making it more likely that those living trees will also be able to catch on fire. So one thing we can do instead is close monitoring. That way, what that means is we can prevent fire damage. And worse fires in the future by when these fires do happen naturally in very secluded areas, just letting them burn, and monitoring them so that way if they do start to approach cities or human structures, then they can be put out. But letting these really vast areas where there's not a huge risk to humans, just letting those areas burn really helps to decrease that amount of biomass in the forest. However, this is already a problem we've kind of started here, because we have been suppressing fires so long. So now one thing we are starting to see used a bit more is prescribed burns. So like we mentioned, dead biomass builds up in forests. This is fuel for really big forest fires, and it's not helping the forest out any because all those nutrients are trapped in that dead woody debris, and not getting added back to the soil. So dead trees are also susceptible to disease and pest spread. So when we just let these forests grow without doing some burning here and there, we're really just creating a buildup for a bad situation of a lot of fuel, stored nutrients that's going to reduce productivity, and dead trees that are going to be susceptible to disease and spreading disease. So what we see is the start of small controlled fires, which burns lots of that dead biomass. So it uses up that fuel to prevent larger forest fires later. So you can see this is very well thought out. This is a very thoroughly planned process. Um, in our picture here, you can see there's a perimeter fire break. So that way there's people all around that fire break to keep the fire in the contained area that they want it in. There's a fire engine ready to go in case anything spreads to a place they don't want it to spread. They're making sure they're burning with the wind direction. So if any does get blown, it should land in our river here, or stream, as opposed to spreading to the further bank. But you can see there are even people waiting there in case that doesn't work. And the other positive of this is that it's also going to promote nutrient recycling as we burn that dead biomass. So, as that biomass gets recycled, the nutrients get added back to the soil, and we end up with a very nutrient rich soil that's going to actually not prevent, what the world? Um, why am I having a brain fart? Encourage, sorry, um, is actually going to encourage growth in the future. So by burning that biomass, adding those nutrients back into the soil, we're going to be encouraging new growth of plants in the area. And so your practice FRQ, identify 2 characteristics of a forest that develop when fires are suppressed and explain how prescribed burns could address each of these characteristics.